It's now been 17 months since the Federal Reserve's last interest rate hike to 5.25%. The reason 17 months is an important number is because that's the exact amount of time between the Federal Reserve's last rate hike in July of 2006 and the onset of the Great Financial Crisis. Back then, the Federal Reserve raised its interest rate quite violently to 5.25%, and 17 months later, the 2008 financial crisis began. Over the last few years, although the Federal Reserve also raised interest rates violently to around the same levels to 5.25%, here we are 17 months later, and there's still no signs of the US economy heading into a downturn. The US unemployment rate sits at 4.1%, a historically low level. Real GDP growth stands at 3%, one of the most rapid rates of growth among developed economies. And in case you don't believe the government's data, the US stock market is hovering only a few percentage points below all-time highs, not exactly a sign that we're in a recession. So is it possible that the Federal Reserve has officially achieved a soft landing? This term, soft landing, is supposed to compare the Federal Reserve's interest rate to an airplane that, after having taken off and risen significantly, is able to come back down gently without causing any turbulence, something that history shows the Federal Reserve has rarely achieved. When we look at the Federal Reserve's interest rate going back to the 1970s and we add the National Bureau of Economic Research's official recession bars, we see that the vast majority of the time when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it ends up playing out for an economic downturn. There's really only been 3 soft landings going back to the 1960s, and today we may be seeing the 4th soft landing. 17 months, or around a year and a half, is the amount of time that it takes for the Federal Reserve's actions to be fully felt by the economy, at least according to most academic research. This is why the financial crisis occurred 17 months after the end of the Federal Reserve's rate hikes. In fact, if we come back to the Federal Reserve's interest rate and simply overlay the unemployment rate on top, many of the times where the Federal Reserve has raised its interest rate, around a year and a half later, you see the US unemployment rate rise too. In fact, if we go one step further and shift forward the Federal Reserve's interest rate, we see that it matches the unemployment rate very closely. This is one of the charts that we've been pointing to throughout 2024 to highlight that recession risks were elevated over the last year. Here we are in 2025, and yes, the unemployment rate has risen as the US economy has cooled down substantially over the last year, but it has not risen to the point of triggering an economic downturn. Now, it's been 17 months since the last rate hike, and the Federal Reserve has even cut interest rates since then. We think this increases the odds that the unemployment rate is likely to flatten out and potentially even turn back down, which is of course not something that you typically see during a recession.